Morning, everyone. Good morning. And Hans, can I ask you also to take your seat? Um, yeah, Hans Martens being the chair still of the CHES coalition till this morning. Great to have everyone seated. And indeed, let me start by welcoming you to the European Policy Center. My name is Elizabeth Kuiper, the Associate Director and Head of the Social Europe and Wellbeing Program. And I would like to welcome you this morning to the CHES annual lecture. CHES stands for the Coalition for Health, Ethics and Society, supported by Johnson & Johnson. And we have the tradition for the CHES annual lecture already for a long time. I believe it's more than 13 years now. And we always had commissioners, high-level officials in the sphere of health. And what we really try to do is shed light on a topic of importance for health. And we were just saying, so it's my pleasure to announce our speaker for today, Peter Piot. I'm very happy. Piot, yes. I mean, it's true that it's more the English version of it, but it's Piot to, I think, true Belgian fashion. And I was just saying that it's an honor for me to have you here with us in person, because I remember personally sitting at home in lockdown and watching you on television by being sensible about what needs to be done in terms of public health, also speaking about vaccine hesitancy, sometimes also with your spouse. So I think we're very happy to have you here with us in person. I will say a few words about your background, although I even doubt whether that's needed. But the topic of today's annual lecture will very much focus on global health. And I think on the one hand, that doesn't need justification. I think we all realize that after a global pandemic, after the current geopolitical context, where we also see that health gets more and more important, think about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where we also see indeed there's a health component to it. Other parts of the world where we also now see, when it comes, for example, to the conflict in Gaza, that indeed health is a very important part of geopolitics very often. On the other hand, I would say, and that's something that we agreed on to discuss with Peter, the question is, especially in light of the upcoming mandate of the institutions and the next European Commission, is global health as important as it should be? Does it have the importance that it warrants? And also, should we perhaps not need to do more from a more concrete perspective when it comes to output-driven policy actions on it? And I think that's going to be the question that Peter is going to answer, and where also we are very happy to have your questions as the audience. So perhaps with that, indeed, Peter, a few words about yourself. You have been working a lot on global health from the very start of your career. You were one of the discoverers of the Ebola virus in 1976. You also have joined the United Nations program on HIV and AIDS, which for us at the European Policy Center is also very important, because we just released a report about progress on HIV, or rather the lack thereof, in light of the Sustainable Development Goals. So that background of yours is also very interesting for us and perhaps warrants a discussion on its own, but we're not going to do that today. And currently you are a special advisor to the President of the European Commission and Handa Professor of Global Health for the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. You have published a memoir in 2012 with the title No Time to Lose, about your professional work. And in addition to that, you have written 16 books and more than 500 scientific articles. So I think with that, I'm going to give the floor to you. We agreed that you would give us an introduction with your thoughts on global health and how to advance the agenda, followed by a Q&A also involving the audience. So again, it's great to have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and good morning, everybody. I realize I'm the second Belgian in a row to give this, because last time was my friend Frank van den Broeke, Minister of Health. Yeah, you actually gave a good introduction on why global health is important, and I believe that not only is Europe a major player, but has a major responsibility in this, and would have some unique contributions to make. And that's not only as dramatically illustrated by the COVID epidemic, but there are many other things. And don't worry, I'm not going to give a talk about lessons learned from COVID. I think we've all had more than an overdose of that. I'd like to look into the future and broaden it beyond epidemics. Although, of course, a major part of my life I worked on epidemics, but there's more than that in the world. And the term global health is actually pretty recent. You can't find it in last century. It emerged around the millennium, was largely driven by the AIDS movement, and it replaced gradually the old terms of tropical medicine, international health, and it really coincided with enlarging the concepts of health in the framework of international development. And I'll talk both about the what and the how, where I feel that we should really move into the next, and into the 21st century. And I like to use that as a quote from one of my favorite authors, the Indian writer Arundhati Roy. You may have read God of Small Things and the Ministry, her last novel of ultimate happiness. But she wrote a lot of essays, and one is called The End of Imagination, when the first nuclear bomb was exploded in India. And part of it is about the meaning of life. And don't worry, it's, I won't go into that too much, but it's about the only dream worth having, she says, is to live while you're alive and die only when you're dead. Just to give this for the weekend to think about. But today I want to focus on just one of her pieces of advice, and that is never simplify what is complicated or complicate what is simple, because simple, and that's something that has served me well in many aspects of my life. And we're at a crossroads in global health, and we need a new paradigm, I believe, what I sometimes call global health 2.0. And I know that's asking a lot because, as just said, global health 1.0, first version, is still quite new. But and global health 1.0 has really saved millions of lives. But the world and health has changed, so we must change too. And furthermore, it seems that the era of quite generous international funding for global health is over or is declining. Let's put it that way. Mainly because of the growing number of existential crises, climate change, but also the wars. And it comes also at a very difficult moment for many low and middle income countries who are facing unaffordable debt payments. We have huge debts also in Europe, each country, but there are ways of keeping our fiscal, health, more or less. But that's not the case for others. So let me start with going back to the paradigm, simple and complex. What I think is relatively simple in my mind, at least, and that is the set of values that bring us all to work in global health. We do it because we believe that each individual life is important. We believe that we should do what we can to prevent the suffering of others. We believe that everyone deserves dignity, safety, and a future that offers hope. And that thinking inspired not only Global Health 1.0, but also the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. And we've made progress on that agenda, but I couldn't agree more that, dear Elizabeth, that not nearly enough. And it's unlikely that we will reach these goals, many of the targets. And we must, do as much as we can. But for me, it's an example of where by setting ultra simplistic, very ambitious goals, but for very complex issues, and that could lead to demoralization when we don't reach them. So we must also continue, of course, to focus on pandemic preparedness to prevent another catastrophe like COVID-19. That's as simple as it comes, although my talk today, as I mentioned, won't focus on it. Now, the good news is that Global Health 1.01 has resulted in impressive results in terms of life saved. And also, it has yielded a wide range of increasingly effective tools to address AIDS, not only AIDS, TB, malaria, vaccine-preventable diseases, maternal, neonatal, and child health, malnutrition, and so on. And the key is to deliver these tools at a much larger scale than to those who are in need. And let's not forget that years ago we fought to provide antiretroviral therapy for all those who needed it. As you heard, when I was the executive director of UNAIDS, and many thought in 1996, when I called when the antiretroviral therapy came on the market in high-income country, and I said this should become affordable for everybody in the whole world, because over 90% of people with HIV were living in low-income countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and the Caribbean. And many thought it was impossible, which of course for me is always the best incentive to go for it. And also the EU was really bad. The Commission was dead against access to antiretroviral therapy, all the donors except France and Luxembourg. When you think of that 30 years later or 25 years later, it's hard to believe, but that's the reality. And these donors, including the Commission, were organizing even workshops why it's not possible to, to provide this type of treatment, because health systems are not there, it's too complicated. So the one reason that they were right is that it was too expensive. And I was very privileged to work very closely with then Secretary General Kofi Annan, who played a key role in putting HIV on the world's agenda. Brought it to the UN Security Council, to the UN General Assembly special session, but particularly to lowering the price of antiretroviral drugs from about $14,000 per person in 1996 at that value, whatever that means today, to today less than $1 a day. And the challenge was, for me, was not to go for the simplistic agendas, like we heard also on vaccines and so on. So, oh, you just abolish intellectual property and then everybody will, will get the products they need. So we really managed to a deal, but it took far too long. And in this case, it was not a scarcity like with the vaccines, because it's small molecules. It was really the price. And now, thanks in large part to the US PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, launched by President Bush in 2003, and the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, malaria, 30 million people, over 30 million people in low-income countries are on life-saving treatment. And it's a safe bet to say that without these programs, most of them would be dead or dying. I find that quite spectacular when you think of it. It's nothing less than a success story that has changed also the perspectives of development in many countries. Because let's not forget, in the mid-90s to 2000, and even a bit afterwards, in many African countries, 40–50% of all deaths were due to AIDS. I mean, it's hard to imagine. So that's why it has such a fundamental issue that was broader than just health. So we must continue to fight for these issues in Global Health 1.0. So it won't be easy by any means, but it's simple in the sense that we have a good idea what to do. Now, let's move on to the complicated things we sometimes try to make too simple. And when I was at UNAIDS, we like to use slogans as a rallying cry. And one of the most effective one was, know your epidemic, know your response. And by that, I meant that, that we need to understand much better what we're dealing with, and also based on the fact that it's extremely rare, not just for HIV, but for any issue, any health, social, development, economic issue, that there is let's say, a regular distribution, and that not the distribution of who's at risk and who's most vulnerable to death and suffering. Now, there are people who are more at risk, and there is, and that therefore, we have to be very careful and adapt our strategies. And I understand why people are always looking for the silver bullet, one size fits all. I also always dream of it. But history has shown over and over again that this just doesn't work. It works in the beginning, but then we have, we need to go and take a deep dive. And of course, we've got some great universal tools. I mean, vaccines, even if not everybody in the universe agrees to that, but bed nets against malaria, antibiotics. But what's important is deploying them with precision. And that's not only a matter of delivering these innovations, and because this continuing innovation, but also innovation in delivery. We need to think about that. We'd like now to focus on three, what I believe are massive historical trends that are going to fundamentally shift the foundations of global health, not to mention about every other sector. And of course, you can all bet, the first one is climate change. I won't go into too much of it, but the reality is that the impact of climate change on health is ever accelerating. And we see a void here in that these two are not coming together, global health and climate change. At the London School, I founded a center called a Center for Climate Change and Planetary Health. And I was pleased to see at the entrance you have a report on that, planetary health. But we need to move and to translate the, let's say, the advocacy and the fact that certain things are very clear. We had now chikungunya and dengue around the Mediterranean in Europe. Extreme heat is killing people, particularly the poor who can't afford air conditioning, extreme weather events and so on. But we need to have now the challenge is to translate it into more operational agendas. And with the European Green Deal, the EU is really at the forefront of cutting emissions. The attention is now shifting also to climate adaptation, and this is where health is really going to be important. But only 5% of funding is going to reducing the health impact. So this needs to change also in Europe. And I've had some discussions with the people in the Commission on this, and I hope this will come. But we need to become operational, and that's the challenge for those who work on health and climate change, and also on the academic side. The second massive historical trend is the rise of digital communication. From the mobile phone, we tend to forget how recent all that is. The internet, social media, and now artificial intelligence. Think of a COVID epidemic without mobile phones, or without, mobile phones where you can see each other. Experienced that myself when I was locked up in a hospital. I could at least communicate with my wife and son, but now artificial intelligence, which I think is, I don't exaggerate that, I think it's a game-changing, what's called a general purpose technology. And it's exciting to imagine that the new interventions and new knowledge that AI will make possible, and it's already everywhere. It's not, we didn't wait for GPT plus. At the same time, it's worrying to consider the new inequalities it will create. And I just finished a brilliant book I can recommend, in The Coming Wave by Mustafa Suleiman, who's one of the founders of DeepMind, if you're familiar with that. And he says, AI is a wave because it will sweep everything in its path, leaving the world remade and reborn. And Suleiman argues over the next 10 years, AI will be the greatest force amplifier in history. This is why it could enable a redistribution of power on historic scale. And the greatest accelerant of human progress imaginable, it will also enable harms, from wars and accidents to random terror groups, authoritarian governments, overreaching corporations, plain thefts, and willful sabotage. That means that it's our job to harness AI. We need to carefully identify AI's opportunities and seize them, and just as carefully identify its risks and mitigate them. I don't know whether you know him, but the AI pioneer is Fei Li, and he often says there's nothing artificial about artificial intelligence. It's made by people for people. And people, and that's so all of us, we must take that responsibility seriously. And I'm not a techie whatsoever, but I think that we are really at the beginning of an enormous revolution. And there's a real interesting, I think sometimes that in global health, in low-income countries, we're more advanced in applying AI to health than in Europe. I think we're in Europe, when I travel around, we're really behind the rest of the world, I would say, because we only think of the dangers and regulation, but not on the opportunities. And last month, I was in Dakar, in Senegal, at the Grand Challenges meeting. Last year, the Grand Challenges was here in Brussels. And it was incredible to hear from some of the 50 principal investigators that had received a grant from the Gates Foundation to pilot, and I quote, equitable AI use in low and middle income countries. They're working on it all over. And the incentive is, of course, that there is a shortage of healthcare workers, the systems don't work often and so on. And so they see AI as a way of, for leapfrogging, just as the mobile phone is now everywhere, and including in countries where landlines are still not functioning. And I think that's what we're seeing now. And again, I'm not an expert, but we really, in order to make the technology work for global health, we will need to invest in people in low middle income countries to build the applications to meet their needs. And as we've all experimenting already, and it's one of the major concerns of EU legislation or proposed legislation, is that effective and equitable AI will require massive local data to feed the algorithms, and local people should collect the data and train the models to, so that they don't have the biases based on ethnicity and gender, socioeconomic determinants, as is too often the case now. That's been. So I hope that we in Europe, we will team up with our colleagues elsewhere. So I just read that European Medicines Agency has now just published a policy or recommendation for AI. So that gives me some hope for Europe. Now we've arrived at the third massive historical trend, and that is the huge demographic and epidemiological shifts occurring in the world. For a long time, our thinking in global health started with children under 5 and their mothers. As a result, child deaths have been cut in half in the past 20 years, from 10 million to 5 million, which is spectacular. You think of it, impressive. But now the world has changed, and in parts of Asia and most of Europe, we already have the oldest populations in the history of the world. And soon more people globally will be over 65 than under 5. And yet the global health community and the funding is still going to the under 5 mortality and the mothers. Nothing against that. Don't misquote me, please. And meanwhile, in other parts of Asia, Latin America, and in much of Africa, we will have large populations in their prime working years. We hope those regions will reap a demographic dividend and experience rapid economic growth. But then these societies will also, and already are on the way of declining fertility and grow older. And then, however, in some parts of Africa, particularly the Sahel and Central Africa, pretty close to Europe here, will continue having a very young population, rapid population growth. And they're slated to more than double in size by 2050. Another massive dislocation that we need to be ready for. And that's on top of climate change, environmental degradation, if not violent conflict. And that's a really a deadly synergy of all these factors. And there's no doubt in my mind also that this will increase greatly immigration pressure on Europe. We're only at the beginning of all this, and we don't realize that, I think. So it means also that patterns of morbidity are changing rapidly as well. Non-communicable diseases, particularly diabetes and cardiovascular diseases, are already the leading cause of death worldwide. And you know, and this is also true in Europe. Um, and that's why I believe also that European CDC should not be limited to infectious diseases, because they're missing what people in Europe get, sick of and die from. Here's a quick breakdown of what we're facing. The burden caused by these chronic conditions will really double every other several years. We will have 1 in 4 people in 10 years' time will be obese in the world. Um, Diabetes will be the number one cause of what's called disability-adjusted life years lost in the world by in a few decades. I'm part of a Lancet Commission on future health threats, and whatever the simulation is, diabetes comes out number one. All that, unless there is another black swan, an epidemic, of course. So it's Friday, of course, and I don't share these facts and figures just to bring down the mood. And I'm someone who I'm always more interested in the action and what to do and the solutions. So what can we do? And first, let me stress one more time that there's still a gigantic unfinished agenda, and also that we have to continue to invest in pandemic preparedness. And I'm very concerned it's rapidly falling off the agenda everywhere. And if we're not vigilant, we may go back to square one, to prevention and preparedness, and pay a very high price. But that's one thing. But we need to take on new things as well. Better at addressing cancer, prevention, diabetes, and mental health. Again, I'm talking about global health, but frankly, it's not different for Europe when you think of it. And we're not equipped for that. Development assistance in health is about, I put the figures here, is 34 billion for infectious diseases and barely 1 billion for non-communicable diseases. So that's and something we have in common. When you look at the leading cause of death in low middle income countries, it's ischemic heart disease, stroke, and pneumonia. They're also the same ones for Europe. So that means that we need to move from assistance to cooperation, and we can probably all learn from each other. We also must get serious about what I call healthy longevity. I don't call about aging, maybe because I'm 74, so it's stigmatizing. It's a term I learned in Singapore, and there's a report by the US National Academy of Medicine, which has that title. And this was also the strong message of a recent communication from Vice President Dubravka Sousa. I'm not sure I pronounce her name correctly, but on demographic change in Europe and presenting a down-to-earth and much-needed toolbox. But we're putting our head in the sand here and in much of the world. And often, the conversation goes into the fixation on the lowest possible age of retirement. So we must make sure that those extra years are healthy and fulfilling both for people and society. That's for me a big agenda, not only for the global health, but for Europe. And then I mentioned the AI solutions. I'm not going to go into that. So that's about the what, but then about the how. And again, that's that's where it's probably most complicated. What let's see, I think that one of the silver linings of this pandemic has been the emergence of regional entities as the locus of initiative of power, and particularly in Africa, with the African Union for the first time at the highest political level, under then the chair of President Cyril Ramaphosa from South Africa, they took on COVID. There was Africa CDC, which was created after another epidemic in West Africa, the Ebola one, 2014. And they were no longer waiting for charity coming from the global north, also because they had no choice. And they really dealt directly with the issues, and no longer would Africa wait for this, the continent took the destiny in their own hands. And less dramatic, but I think in Europe we did the same, thanks to the leadership of Ursula von der Leyen, that, and without a strong legal competency in health, took on the epidemic. And I was very proud that I could work with her as a special advisor. Now, let me suggest 3 ways, and then it is the end, of conceiving a more regional approach to global health. You hear I like lists of 3. First, the rise of regional manufacturing of health tools, offers great potential to finally solve the persistent problem of inequitable access globally. We all know that scarcity is the enemy of equity, and that's what we were faced with the COVID vaccines. And when there isn't enough to go around, those with the power and resources have priority access, and that's a fact of life. I don't think any treaty is going to change that. And also I realized something when Prime Minister Modi in India banned the export of vaccines, because India has become the pharmacy of the world. And with COVAX, that initially we had counted on Indian manufacturers. And first I was angry, but then I was thinking, I always try to think, what would I do? And I said, I would have done the same. Modi is, whether you like him or not, but he's elected by Indians, not by Africans or others. So, it's a normal thing that you would then fight for access for your own citizens. So that means that we need to find structural solutions. And because of global supply chains and so on, they were affected by COVID. But given this reality, regional manufacturing is the only realistic solution for me. And the good news is that there are several local manufacturing initiatives that are progressing very well. As I saw when I visited Institut Pasteur Dakar, when I mentioned Senegal last month, they've been producing yellow fever vaccines for decades. And now technological developments make it more possible with good help from the Commission. Very happy that the EU has committed 1.1 billion euro through the budget. INPA is very active on this, the EIB and Team Europe, to develop also solid business models, because it can't be just a white elephant. It has to be grounded in business and commitment from big buyers. So that's, and I think we can learn from that also when we talk about our critical medicines issues, very close to the heart of the previous speaker of last year and the Belgian presidency. Second, the rise of centers of excellence and innovation and implementation capacity in Asia and Latin America, also in Africa, is changing the center of gravity in research and development. And this is actually due, thanks to many years of investment from global health partners in high-income countries, particularly Europe and and the US. So that means we have to rethink our approach, because they are now there. We should not perpetuate the status quo. You mentioned discovery of Ebola virus. In 1976, we did that in Antwerp. Why? Because there was not a single laboratory in then called Zaire that was capable of isolating viruses. Today, and we've been accused of being colonial and so on, but it was that or no isolation. But today, Professor Muyembe's lab in Kinshasa can do sequencing, etc., as well as any lab in Europe. So we have really centers of excellence here. And that means that agenda settings and decision making should increasingly move closer to the problems. And that means a complete reshaping of research collaboration. That is really far more partnerships. I think that EDCTP is really on the way with this, but our general research agenda, the Horizon Zone, should really invest far more in this. And then the third way of conceiving of a more regional approach, global health, has to do with a much needed reform of global institutions, UN system institutions, development banks, and global funds. Even if the Global Fund and Gavi really, they originated around the millennium, they've been a true success story. Yeah? But now, 20 years later, they should continue to focus far more on countries' priorities, work in greater synergy with countries and with each other. And it means also that they should place their staff where the action is. not where the headquarters and the golden bubbles happen to be. And so add all this further, this makes the basis of new global health, and based on genuine partnerships. And although I certainly accept that there are other angles than the regional approach, but reducing inequities and so on. And today the accountability is to the donor, but there should be accountability to the communities and to the people. That's a real accountability. And agendas set and then executed by those most concerned have a better chance of succeeding than top-down programs decided here in Brussels, Geneva, Washington, or Beijing also. And finally, what does this mean for Europe? We do now have a global health strategy, which I hope will soon be agreed, be a council conclusion, pretty weak, but at least it's better than nothing. And it's the result of a multi-sectoral collaboration within the Commission. And it's largely written in the spirit of what I just discussed, I must say. And it's interesting to see that the broad priorities, I won't repeat them, but they're actually, that there isn't that much difference of what's needed in global health and for Europe. And we have something unique to offer for global health because of our own diversity in 27 member states with different levels of development, experience, our attention and our commitment to health as a right. So the good news is that we are now, I think, we have a strategy, and we also include all the issues that we have mentioned, although I wish there would have been more attention for climate change. AI is not really much in there. And I think that, as I mentioned, we should invest much more of the substantive EU R&D budget than in global health, besides a relatively small budget of EDCTP and HERA for this. And finally, my global health and health security must become an integral part of external policies in the EU. It's not there. As is the case already in a few member states, they have global health ambassadors. I was this week actually in Stockholm. Sweden has a global health ambassador for many years, started with 8, France has one. We had a meeting of global health diplomacy. But particularly the US is very active there. It's really part of their soft diplomacy. And so last week I addressed a symposium in the US Department of State, opened by Secretary Antony Blinken. I know he's very busy, but time for that, on health security and diplomacy in the 21st century. And Europe needs more goodwill. We're in very bad shape wherever I go, with Africa or Asia, Latin America. We are not very popular at the moment, to say the least. And so this is where global health could be one way and a channel that is open. So let me stop here. And I spoke, and sorry I spoke too long, but I'll end here. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Peter. Mainstream global health into their foreign affairs policies. And indeed, at EU level, we now have the global health strategy as well. And I think you mentioned a few positive elements. I think in general, you also mentioned, of course, that one should never be ultra simplistic. On the other hand, my question would be in relation to the toolbox that you mentioned for demography. Do we have a similar toolbox for global health in the sense that the actions that the Commission proposed in the global health strategy, are they concrete enough? Also knowing that we have an upcoming mandate of the Commission where we hope that global health will remain on the agenda. Are we clear enough what the EU should do? I think at the same time, I think that's part of the question. You mentioned the role of the ECDC. is the ECDC as powerful as the CDC in the States? Because again, we have seen also in the global pandemic that the CDC has been quite powerful in terms of the money they have, the budget, the resources. My question would be, even though, of course, the budget as well as the competences for the ECDC have been increased, is it still as powerful enough to play that role in the global health strategy?
Thanks, Elizabeth. Lots of questions in one. But yeah, when you look, you also mentioned Japan. So when you look at the last G7, or still there, Japan's chair, there's a major emphasis on global health. And the question is that, to paraphrase someone, who would I call in the Commission on the EU when I want to discuss global health? I wouldn't know. There's nobody. And it's still, the positive side is that it's a collaboration between, this INPA and health and Santé, it's called, I guess, and HERA and BIT and, the external service. But there needs to be a strong focal point, and there's no accountability that I see that's included in the proposal. I think it's a very useful and welcoming framework. And let's not forget there was one in, I think, 2010, which was actually everybody had forgotten about, that never implemented. So I think the good news is there is a framework, but now there has to be a plan with priorities, and of course with member states. And some member states are pretty strong in it. And so that I hope will lead to some political agreement and commitment, and for the next commission, because unless we completely demented that about the pandemic that's just behind us, and with all the we're in a sea of global health, Europe, we need to take that on as a priority. Secondly, specifically, so that for the next commission, I think also healthy longevity. Again, there's a toolbox, but the question is that some people say, oh, the commission, EU no competency in this. However, it's going to become such a fundamental issue. Not only talk about health, economy, social issues, stability, democracy, just name it, that this should become a part of it. And again, when you look at the report of the National Academy of Medicine of the US, there was not a single European in that group. Even if of the 10 countries in the world with the oldest populations, 5 are in Europe, 5 are in East and Southeast Asia. So work to do. ECDC, no, I think Africa CDC has a bigger mandate, has more power than European CDC, but they don't have the resources. So I think I was there Wednesday. So there is it's something that I hope will lead to a stronger interaction between some member states, and because not all of them have a public health institution. But I think that I'm always an optimist, and I always think that never miss a good crisis, so that this crisis of COVID will lead to stronger global health activities. But for me, what's key also is that the external service should also have at least someone pretty senior who is, for whom global health is responsibility. And then we can go to G7, G20. There it's also, we're not in BRICS, of course, but also in the UN General Assembly and all that we come. There was hardly any in these high-level meetings in New York on health. Europe was pretty absent, and that was, I would say, to say the least, an embarrassment. Also considering that we are the biggest donors for many of these things. We give the money, but we don't, are not active on policy.
I have many more questions, but I'm sure that at the floor, I think we have some journalists. I think Carlo, Jamina, would you like to pass the mic to Carlo for his first question? And perhaps, Carlo, if you can state your name and your affiliation, that would be great.
Carlo Martuscelli from Politico. Can you hear me? Is this working? Okay, great. Yeah, so thank you for taking my question. You mentioned that there's no one to pick up the phone when it comes to global health, paraphrasing, I think, Nixon or Kissinger. What should the title of that person, if we created it, be? Is that a EU global health ambassador, or just to get a sense of it? And then also, I had a second question. Forgive me, I'm a journalist. I always have to ask about what's going on in the moment, but we're seeing in China this, it seems like a pneumonia filling up the hospital wards. What are your thoughts on that? Thank you.
Yeah, on the first one, I'm really not into titles, and I don't care, couldn't care less. But it's something that I would say at a level that's senior enough to be taken seriously in international fora, and also internally to be taken seriously and with authority and accountability. One thing that I'm often frustrated by when I see these programs and communiques and so on, that I don't see what are the KPIs for accountability within the Commission, within Europe. I know some of it is political, but that's the way I think. So what are the deliverables? But I think it's, for me, there's a need for, and all the various parts, the Commission, where the global health has to be dealt with, that there is a pretty senior responsibility. But then there is one person who is, yeah, I can call, well, not me, but others. Now, on China, I don't have more information than you have, I think. But one thing that I like to specify, this is about children. It's a pediatric problem, it seems. And that makes it, the latest I saw was that the prime candidates could be known viruses like RSV, respiratory syncytial virus. I hope that soon we will know more. But because it's limited to children, if that's confirmed, again, a lot of if, then I'm less worried in a sense for a big global epidemic. But yeah, but it's what I appreciate it is that this time WHO, the World Health Organization, has publicly requested for more and immediate information from China.
Good. Who is next? Are there more questions from the audience?
Hi, Fionn from DSW. We're a global health NGO. Just wanted to come back to the global health strategy, which commits to health in all policies approach at EU level. But we've seen the current proposal for the pharma legislation, for example, dissolve commitments in global health. So the recital that commits to exploring pull incentives for neglected tropical diseases, for example, is missing from the current proposal. Would be interested in your reflections on the role of the EU in introducing novel incentives, which would be crucial for taking those, and I'm glad that you mentioned the EDCTP, taking those products that we're now seeing coming through the pipeline, and would also be crucial for the sustainability of the regional manufacturing sites that you mentioned, which need products to manufacture in peace times to be able to also react in crisis times.
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. I think that logically, the pharma strategy concentrates on, the EU itself. But again, we're not isolated. And just think of so-called tropical diseases like dengue and chikungunya. 10 years ago, you'd say, okay, that's not our problem. I mean, I thought I was wrong, but still, you could. But today, also because of climate change, we need to invest in so-called neglected tropical disease or neglected infectious disease and so on. So, and what are the incentives for that? Because there is really no market incentive for most of them. For dengue, there will be market incentive, because there will be for travelers and prophylaxis and so on. So, but there are a number of mechanisms. something that I think has been quite successful is IMI in Europe. It requires co-funding, but for example, I know personally because in these days I was still active, but that funded the Ebola vaccine trial with the Janssen vaccines, and then and this was collaboration between the University of Sierra Leone and the London School of Hygiene, Tropical Medicine, and INSERM in France, and that without IMI, we would never have been able to do this phase 3 trial. I mean, very expensive trials in the midst of a terrible epidemic. So there are mechanisms, but it's not there in the the pharma strategy lacks. I think there's a gap to be more explicit about it, and that again, the US has it. You know, US has it, and it doesn't mean that everything that the US does we should copy, but we don't have to reinvent the wheel, and they have different mechanisms. And I know there are arguments about vouchers and other things. Whatever the mechanism is that suits Europe, but we must have such a mechanism. I totally agree, but it shouldn't stop at the let's say the R&D phase, but also at the access and manufacturing. That's why I think, in all fairness, we are at the top for supporting local vaccine manufacturing as the Team Europe, EIB. That's, I think, there others can learn from us. So I always think to see what the best everywhere, and then we do some shopping with pragmatic approach. Thanks for the question. Thank you.
We'll come back to the floor, but I have a question for you that I'm very interested in your answer, because you mentioned planetary health. And indeed, my colleague Danielle Brady in September wrote a report about planetary health. And we had a really interesting event where we launched the report, where also the European Commission attended, and we had a very lively discussion about the importance of the concept on the one hand. Yeah. On the other hand, the importance of implementing and the implementation of the concept. And I think the Commission was being very honest with us by saying, well, yes, we have now created a Directorate General that we call One Health, which is the concept of planetary health. At the same time, we're thinking so much in silos. So we are struggling inside in the Commission with how to roll this out. And I think especially the current political context, me being Dutch with the outcome of the Dutch elections yesterday, where you see that also climate skepticism is growing. How do we manage to indeed take the concept and also make it more tangible?
Yeah, no, that's very much on my mind. And on the one hand, I think that health will be more and more the human face of climate change. People are affected. So in that sense, talking about climate skepticism and so on, but in that sense, it becomes more concrete to citizens' lives. And that's more of a political reflection on it. But as I alluded to, my concern is also that we need now to fill in what it means concretely, the action. And, there are some wins, I think. For example, whatever we need to do to prevent cardiovascular disease, diabetes, so on, is actually good for climate, because it means eat the right things, and so the things that are less contributing to to the bad emissions and so on. And so I think we should identify a number of win-wins, but also the whole healthcare sector is a major source of emissions. So how to make our hospitals friendly and so on. There are some programs that's starting. So I think there we could probably, one of the strengths of Europe is norm setting and regulatory issues, and could issue norms for the healthcare sector to make it more friendly. And the One Health approach, indeed, silos are, I think we must have a gene for it and for territoriality and infighting based on entrenchment and so on. And I see this every day in the Commission. But it's in every administration. Nobody has the monopoly of it. And so how to go over that? And this is where I think that's where leadership is so important. But One Health, I also in London, we started with the One Health Masters and so on with the Royal Veterinary College. The first thing you need to adapt is this, like with any collaboration, is that the acronyms don't mean the same thing, or it's kind of the language to start with, and mutual respect that what you do is really important. So I think that in today's world, if we don't break the silos and the walls between the silos, we're all going to suffer. But I think this is something where what we discussed before is that I don't see a platform in Europe where either in a think tank way or where people come together around these issues. Maybe that's something that you can do here, because there is a lot going on in bits and pieces. We need to bring it together. And there's great interest among young people for this. So that's also giving hope. But then we need to move the big bureaucracies. And also we have to be realistic. These are very expensive undertakings, and that often hit the poorest the most, and also take hospitals, making them carbon free or carbon emission free. In many countries, from Germany to Belgium, about every hospital today is in the red. Then we're going to ask to add that. Okay, so we need imagination here.
Really. I am aware of time. Is there any last question from the audience? Yes.
Thank you so much. My name is Marilyn Fondel. I work for Illumina. I had a question on global pathogen surveillance. Many have said that efforts on that front are very fragmented. Is there more, in your opinion, that the EU and the rest of the world can do?
Yeah, thanks. A good question. That's I think on that one, it's perhaps there's a lot of good progress. And in global health, for example, there are two major initiatives in Africa, led by Africa CDC and with support from the Gates Foundation and the Commission with INPA. And then in ASEAN, out of Singapore, and ASEAN is trying also to develop a CDC, but they can't agree. If you think we have major differences and in Europe also there was major funding out of ECDC to ECDC to do and to start building the capacity. But also with the technology today, it's far easier to do and cheaper. But I think it's essential. And going back to the China question, this has to be by definition a global initiative. It can be regionals, but that where exchange of information is really in real time and without punishment. We all remember when Omicron was found in South Africa, how did the world react? Close the border for anybody from Southern Africa. When it was, frankly, that in theory can work if it's only limited and then you can contain that. But it was already everywhere anyway. I think the sequencing technology is now moving more and more. That's a good news, also thanks to the technologies we developed. But it's now the exchange of information that is key. And that's where I think, well, the media are also important, because a lot of that information is now, before it reaches the official channels and the ministries of health, it's already on Twitter and on what have you. And so that's what we have to monitor. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Peter. I think that we could have gone on for much longer because I had many more questions, for example, about how to finance global health, given the limited funding, the decreasing funding. Also, perhaps your thought on the global pandemic treaty, to what extent we're going to end with the global or the lowest, lowest common denominator, or your expectations about perhaps a little bit more of an ambitious treaty. But I think that we're keeping for the next time, perhaps, that we're speaking. I would like to thank you very, very much for your intervention and for your expertise. I think it really shows that indeed the need for more accountability on global health and the need to do also more, I think, is something that speaks very much to us as the European Policy Center. Because in September, we indeed released a report with recommendations about the European Health Union, where the European Commission, in our opinion, is taking a rather limited stance on how to define a European Health Union, because they really define it as the 5 pillars that they presented themselves. And we indeed also recommended to do more on global health. So I think my colleague Danielle and I will take that up as a recommendation also to ourselves to indeed keep working on the topic. As always, we're very open also for your input, any thoughts that you may have, because I believe that in today's world, think tanks are important. And therefore, we really appreciate you coming to us with your thoughts also to keep the topic on the agenda. So we hope that von der Leyen will listen to you, that you will remain her advisor also for the next mandate. And with that, I would like to ask the floor for a big applause for Peter Piot.